Let's talk about supervised release. The person that gets arrested or goes through the initial judicial process, they are starting off in the judicial branch of government. That means that they are going to be responsible to pretrial services, and federal probation officers are going to oversee that pretrial period, unless the person is in detention, in which case they're going to be beholden to the detention center, whether it's the federal detention center or its contract facility. Staff will oversee you, but federal probation officers are going to be responsible for you in doing things like the pre-sentence investigation report. After the judge imposes sentence, you transition from the judicial branch of government, the courts, into the executive branch of government, of course, which is the president, the attorney general, the director of the Bureau of Prisons, regional directors, wardens, and all staff in the BOP. And then even when you leave the prison facility and you transition to home confinement or a halfway house period, you are still in the executive branch of government. You are being overseen by the Bureau of Prisons, even if they are outsourcing some of that responsibility or day-to-day responsibility to a case manager in the halfway house, who will oversee you while you're on home confinement. At least that's the policy today, and I'm filming this in September of 2025. I know the new leadership of the BOP is making a lot of changes. I'm super enthusiastic about what I am seeing and optimistic that more great changes are coming that will influence all people in federal prison. But once you finish with the Bureau of Prisons, you then transfer to this other phase, which is called supervised release. And I think virtually everybody in federal prison, in the federal system, that gets a felony conviction, after they conclude their obligation with the executive branch, they return to the judicial branch, which means a federal probation officer will have authority over you. And so it's probably important for you to understand how things are going to change when you transition from the Bureau of Prisons control to a federal probation officer's control to conclude your terms of supervised release. So when you look at the literature, the probation officers are defined as the court's eyes and ears. Okay, the probation officer is supposed to be monitoring your compliance with the conditions of your supervised release. So what will happen is, after you finish with the Bureau of Prisons, you will meet with a federal probation officer, and one of the first things they're going to do is read your judgment and commitment order, as well as the judge's statement of reasons. The probation officer will very likely read that to you, ask you to sign and initial it, that you understand these conditions of your release, because they can violate you. They can put you back in prison if you are out of compliance. So you want to know what probation officers expect and what can you do to accelerate your pathway to early termination of supervised release. And at the end of this video, I will tell you how I got early termination of supervised release and give you some suggestions that I think you should start planting these seeds right now. Even if you haven't even been sentenced, start planting these seeds right now. But first, let's just talk about what are probation officers going to expect. You should expect that the person that you're getting along with in pre-trial services before you were convicted, it's unlikely that that person will be your probation officer on the other side of the journey. These probation officers typically specialize in one area, pre-trial or supervised release, and they also will have different levels of cases. You know, some people will focus on white collar fraud. Some might focus on people convicted of sex offenses. Some might focus on violent offenders, right? And there will be different levels. Your role is to try and position yourself to get the highest level of liberty. And to do that, you always want to be working to build a record of honesty and transparency. And that will go into the lesson I'll share at the end of the video. You want to provide timely communications, okay? Typically, they're going to ask you to provide a report every 30 days that is really detailed and invasive. At least that's the way you'll feel it. For me, I could care less what it looked like, because I was so excited to be out of prison and done with the Bureau of Prisons. But you have to fill out this report. You have to be truthful on that report, because if anytime you lie on a federal government form, there are actually criminal penalties associated with that. You can get convicted of Title 18, Section 1001 for lying to a federal officer or lying on a federal form and go right back to prison. So be really scrupulous about honesty and keep very good records. I kept I still keep very good records. In fact, it's part of our lesson is you've got to build your own accountability metrics. The more initiative you show in being compliant and organized, the more effective you're going to be when you start advocating for yourself to get early termination of supervised release. Okay? Now, supervised release always has standard conditions of supervised release. The judge recites them at sentencing. So he'll talk about reporting. He'll talk about you have to have a job, employment. You have to have a stable residence. You may be restricted to travel to only your jurisdiction. You may be able to get that lifted with the permission of your probation officer. But there will initially be travel restrictions, drug and alcohol testing, financial disclosures, as I said, every 30 days. No new crimes, of course. What other things were the standard conditions? You just have to know all of these conditions, and they will read them to you both at sentencing, when the judge imposes sentencing, but also when you transition to supervised release. But in addition to those sentences, there are frequently special conditions, and those special conditions can include restitution payment plans, requirements that you participate in substance abuse. They may include community service or volunteer work. We've done a lot of that work for people who come on supervised release that want to volunteer with prisonprofessors.org, our nonprofit. There will be location monitoring and curfews, and there will be other conditions that might be specific to your case, such as you cannot get credit without permission of a probation officer. Again, you cannot travel outside of the jurisdiction without a probation officer. You can't communicate with other people who have a felony background without reporting it to your probation officer. And if you violate any of these terms, you should know that the probation officer may violate you. Now, to violate you, there's like a due process thing that has to happen is they will provide a technical violation that might state that you didn't comply with the terms, okay? And I can give you many examples of people who had to return to prison for what you might consider ridiculous technical violations. What do I consider a ridiculous technical violation? I'll give you an example. A guy got out of prison, let's just call him Bob, and one of the conditions of his supervised release was that he couldn't get credit without permission of his probation officer. And Bob got out of prison, was just a typical working guy and had a job and started to get stable. He got he was like a manager of a Best Buy or something like that, got an apartment, starting to get stable, but he's going through 3 years of supervised release. Now, there's kind of a pattern of people who go into the system is you eventually get used to it. You get used to prison. You get used to living on supervised release. It kind of becomes a nuisance, and you almost feel like you're free. Well, you're not free. You're not free until you're done. And Bob found that out. So he was like in 2 years or so, a year and a half or so into his supervised release term. And his son turned 16 or 17 or 18, and he wanted to buy a car. And his son asked his dad if he would co-sign on the loan. So Bob, thinking, well, what's the big deal? I'm just going to co-sign. I'm not really borrowing the money. And he co-signed on the loan. But that, of course, showed up on a credit report. And as the probation officer was coming to the end of Bob's term a year later, the probation officer ran a credit report. And she saw that Bob had come up and co-signed on this loan. And when she confronted him about it, he said, "Oh, it was my son. He asked me to co-sign on the loan, and I did." And she said, "Well, you didn't ask permission to do that, and that violates the terms of your supervised release, and I'm going to violate you." And this guy thought he was almost done. He's within months of being finished, but he has to go back before the federal court. The probation officer did not ask the judge to return him to prison, but he did ask to give him another year of supervised release. The U.S. attorney that represented the government did not ask them to violate Bob and return him to prison. Just asked him to give another year of supervised release. But the judge said Bob needs to learn a little bit more about the consequences of his actions. And he sent him back to prison for 6 months and gave him another year of supervised release. What were the consequences for Bob? Well, he lost his job at Best Buy. His credit took a hit because he had a lease on an apartment that he could no longer pay. He went into custody, total life disrupted again. And this is what you want to be aware of. right? When you come into the system, you have to understand the severity of this system, and you have to be working to do everything within your power to get the best possible outcome. Of course, if somebody has new criminal conduct, they would expect to get violated. But judges have the ability to assess your period of supervised release. And that's why I really encourage you, start building a very strong record of demonstrating that you started today to build this record of compliance and transparency. I really encourage you, I discourage you from hiring a prison consultant. Instead, work to educate yourself. Visit prisonprofessors.org, learn all the things that you could do, build a profile that starts documenting who you are. Write your biography, write daily journals, write your book reports, write a release plan. Demonstrate that you're serious about preparing for success. And that way, when you meet with your probation officer, a year from now, 3 years from now, 5 years from now, there's this massive body of work that you could use as an asset. And you will use this as an asset to advocate for the highest level of liberty at the soonest possible time. You could use this asset even to argue for early termination of supervised release. In my case, because I was so methodical in documenting my journey through 9,500 days in prison, I didn't even ask for early termination of supervised release. The government asked unilaterally after a year to terminate my supervised release, and the judge granted it. So I want you to know you are going to be your best advocate. There is no prison consultant that can do this for you. You have to do it. And you can get all that information for free just by working through prisonprofessors.org. I would really encourage you to subscribe so that you get our newsletter and you learn about the advocacy work that we do to try and help people. But this really isn't about me. It's about you. I will always make the 3 promises. I'll never lie to you. I'll never ask you to do something I didn't do. And I'll never charge you a penny. But I know some people want to talk to others, and the only one I recommend is my friend and sponsor, Justin Paperny. He hosts a webinar every week for members of our community. You can participate by going to whitecollaradvice.com/nonprofit and get responses to your questions. But just never forget, you have to become your best advocate. And the harder you work, the more opportunities are going to open for you. I am Michael Santos, founder of Prison Professors, and I believe in you.